Okay. Job losses were running at over 700,000 a month in America a few months ago, and job losses have been declining. That's job losses. The descent is not so steep. In September, 260,000 jobs were lost in America. That doesn't sound like a recovery to me. I know that employment lags recovery and so forth, but all the same, there are now 7.2 million freshly unemployed people in America. 7.2 million. Try telling them that the disaster's over. They haven't got jobs. Right now, there is a repossession every 14 seconds in America. That is 6,000 repossessions a day in America. 6,000 families losing their home every day in America. Right now. Again, you're probably not feeling this crisis quite as much here. And one of the reasons we're not feeling it is because the central banks are flooding the system with liquidity. But that doesn't mean to say it's not happening. And it's actually, I think, a two-tone recovery, where at the rich end, there's lots of money floating around, but at the poor end, this is happening. And how many of those 7.2 million jobs are going to come back? And when will they come back? I don't think for quite some time. And part of that is because a lot of those jobs are really over in China and India and places like that. When those jobs come back, that's where they'll be. Now, this is one of the really interesting arguments that's going on right now. Debt as a percentage of GDP. Now, Japan is at 180%, and everybody's scratching their heads like crazy. They don't really know what to think about that. Japanese save a huge amount, personally. So there's a lot of wealth in the consumer sector in Japan. But 180% seems very, very problematic. In the whole of the OECD, it's gone from just under 70% to over 90%. The UK, where we have debauched our economy in the most unconscionable way in the past half dozen years, our debt has gone up in a very short space of time from 45% to 75% of our GDP. And the Kant agreement is that it's going to level out at about 100% of GDP across the US, UK, France, Germany, whatever. That we'll all be at about 100% of GDP. Well, I have two comments on that. One is that that's, I don't believe, in the least true. It's based on unbelievably optimistic financial scenarios. I think it's going to be much, much more than that. But the second is, what does it mean? I don't know what it means to have 100% of your GDP as debt to a country. I've been trying to think it through and figure it out. I think we're moving already to a stage where about 13% of taxes go immediately to pay the interest on servicing the debt. Now, particularly if we move well north of 100%, where does that get to? Does it get to 20%? So that 1/5 of everything you're doing, all the taxes you're getting in, go to pay the debt, which is meantime increasing dramatically. Dramatically. By very large numbers. We'd be here even longer if I started doing a riff on that. But how sustainable is that? I really don't see that it is. The China trade balance, the thing you want to look at is here, right? China was accumulating about $700 billion a year of external bonds, mostly US dollar bonds. But it's having its own problems. One of the major reasons that Germany was hit is the same reason that China was hit last year in the economy, is because you're both exporting nations. So you export much more than other countries. And of course, if you're exporting but your customers stop buying, then the German economy goes down 6.3%, which I think it did last year. And that is very, very problematic. And then the European Central Bank floods the system with money and sort of tries to keep things going while all these other economies recover and they start buying your BMWs again. That's why you haven't suffered so much. But China, in particular, had to sort of react to the fall in the economy within China by lending lots of money inside China. It lends lots of money inside China. It hasn't got money to buy US bonds. And with the US having to sell over $1 trillion worth of bonds a year, and the UK around £200 billion worth of bonds a year. There's Herb Stein, an economic advisor to the president, had a great phrase: that which cannot go on forever won't. And that can't go on forever, and so therefore it won't. So what's going to happen at the point when that debt becomes unsustainable? So the interesting thing for you and me and all of us and every company we work for and every organization we're worrying about is that we're right now at a situation where we actually don't have a clue what's going to happen to the economy. All we know is that it's becoming more and more volatile. What kind of recovery scenario? Will we have inflation or deflation? Will liquidity ease or will it be tight? So on the rally, my uncle was a dentist in Bad Godesberg, so I'm very fond of dentists because I used to go and stay with him every summer. And the dentist rally is that, well, January, when the big crash comes, everybody says, well, my tooth hurts a bit, but I'm not going to go to the dentist. Now it's October, and my tooth's hurting an awful lot. And so the dentists actually all had a bit of a problem in January, February of this year. They weren't getting much business. Now they're getting lots of business from all the people who should have gone to see them in January. So a dentist rally is when you've got inventory restocking, consumers who are tired of deferring their gratification and think they're going to spend even if they haven't got the money. London house prices are up 30% in the past 3 or 4 months. Why? Because the pound has collapsed and everybody's sweeping in from Eurozone to buy up houses in London. The same thing's happening in New York. But is that going to last? Is that just a temporary rally or not? Everybody talks about scenarios. A V-shaped scenario is a very quick recovery. That's if the central banks have overdone the liquidity and there's so much money that everybody starts spending, we get more bubbles and we're back to the same thing. Tick-shaped is a bit slower. W-shaped is it goes up and is the double dip scenario. U-shaped, slower recovery. Bar-shaped, much slower recovery. L-shaped, which is no recovery. Lightning-shaped, you think you've got a recovery, but actually it was just a hiccup on the way down. It's a false recovery. And backslash-shaped, which is no recovery at all. It's just all the way down. The great secular Untergang des Abendlandes. I think right now people are arguing as to whether it's V, W, or lightning right now. And really nobody knows. Anybody who tells you that they really understand this is I think, not to be trusted, because it is just such a finely balanced issue of a whole bunch of policy decisions and a whole bunch of understanding what the underlying strength of the economy really is. As you can tell from me, I'm more on the negative side, somewhere between W and lightning. But I, like everybody else, don't understand the power of liquidity, so I don't know whether we'll suddenly get a gigantic V-shaped inflationary bubble. Stock market is up an unprecedented 60% this year. That's only happened once before in the last more than 100 years. And it happened that once before in 1933. Right now in America, 90-day lates means people are over 90 days late in paying their mortgages, going up and up and up and up and up, right through to now. Fully foreclosed, that means when the bank gets fed up and repossesses, even though they're being told by everybody, do not repossess, find a way to keep the people in their homes, it's up very significantly to well over 2% of all homes. Bank real estate owned is down because banks are selling off for pennies on the dollar the properties that they have foreclosed on. Very, very problematic. So it's a two-tone economy where people, Coutts in London, which is the rich person's bank, has never been lending so much money these last couple of months as it is now. So if you're considered creditworthy, it's actually turning into a boom time. If you're one of these poor people, if you're one of the 7 million newly unemployed in America, if you're one of the many million, if you're one of the 6,000 a day having your home repossessed, it's not exactly a comfortable time. Inflation or deflation, what's going to be the impact? There's some early signs of inflation stoking up. You'd know much more about this than me, but there is. And of course, once you've seen it, that's when you should have, a year before that, have raised interest rates and clamped massively down on liquidity. It's very interesting that Australia this week raised its interest rates. And I didn't point out that Australia's debt as a percentage of GDP has actually declined on that chart. So there's some winners, but there are many, many losers right now. So what's the longer-term impact? Now, remember I was talking about, is this a secular decline? Well, the median household income last year in the US, and that was sort of before the crash was really happening, is lower than it was 10 years before. Is lower. The size of the private sector in the UK is fractionally lower. That's the forecast for 2010. Than it was 12 years before. By the way, the size of the public sector in the UK is much bigger, so the economy keeps going. The only trouble is that the public sector has to be paid for by the taxes from the private sector, so if you're not growing your private sector, how can you grow your public sector except by living above your means, which brings us back to what we were talking about before. But so therefore, across the Western world, the decade has been lost. Nothing has happened. And what that really is just the sign of the economy moving massively over to developing countries. Meantime, Goldman Sachs has increased its value at risk dramatically. And this is their own publicly stated reports. Now, they have proved brilliant at riding this risk wave, so all kudos to them. But this is happening in other banks as well. The risk is again being taken by the banks. So, what's going to happen? New incomprehensible securities will continue to be created. The super senior CDO, which was the biggest cause of the problem, there's a brilliant book written by Gillian Tett called Fool's Gold, which goes into this brilliantly. Unfortunately, in that book, even Gillian admits she doesn't really understand what that super senior is. And nobody does, because you originate a mortgage in Oklahoma, and then you sell it to a local bank, and they package it up in a security, and then somebody borrows money on it. And by the time you're over in a German second-tier bank owning that security, you absolutely haven't got a clue about this family in Oklahoma. And you don't know they're in Oklahoma. You don't know they're a family. You don't know anything about them. You just know that someone somewhere along the way rated it AAA. And nobody knows. Everybody, I hope, is feverishly trying to go through all these securities and figure out what the hell they are, which they didn't bother to do over the past decade. But actually, what I suspect is they're not even bothering. They're just sort of hanging around. Anybody want to hazard a guess how many mortgage-backed securities, these dud securities that nobody wants, have been bought in by the Fed in America? To what value? Can anybody guess the value of all of the ones that they have bought?
5%.
Somebody said 3.5 billion, somebody said 5%. 300. It's 900. $900 billion worth of stinking fish is now piled up inside the Fed. And nobody has a clue what's in this pile of stinking fish. They'd rather not touch it, thank you very much. Bank stuffies, I think, will continue to get stuffed. Nobody has shown a determination to do anything about the problem that I articulated. Shareholders will continue to get stuffed. Central banks and governments will continue to rescue failing banks 100% until the day that too big to fail becomes too big to rescue. That is the moment when everything goes really problematic. The stuffers will continue to receive large bonuses, and the stuffies will too, who report that they made all this profit on this stuff that I bought from that bank, even if the profit doesn't eventually eventuate. Western societies will continue to live out their means, and all of that until the next crash. This is the Chinese bank lending within China suddenly taking off, and that's a harbinger of the future problem, because when China has enough to do inside China with all the capital it's generating, why wouldn't it spend it there? It, after all, can't be particularly happy about what it's done with its money so far, which is to invest in US treasuries, which pay absolutely nothing and which have devalued enormously. Okay, so those were the basic causes of the last crash: easy money, living above our means, the job drain to the east, and the bank oligarchy. And I think what I've just gone over is that nothing serious has been done about any of those four things, from what I can see. I'm just some sucker who pays taxes. So the crisis next time, another financial system collapse, complicated, I think, by currency collapse and high inflation, if you believe that it's going to fall out on the inflation side, and a refusal or inability of the traditional funders to bail the West out, in which case you're in that appalling spiral that Argentina saw as a result of what they call Peronista policies, but I don't see a huge amount of difference between Peronista policies and what we're pursuing. Short term, it looks like deflation, but people are making remarks like this at the moment. I'm saying, this is me, JPM, maybe, but when? Very difficult to tell. Currencies. Pound and the dollar I see as the biggest losers, and I did do this slide a few months ago, and it's already started to happen, but I think there's a lot more to come. The winners will be those who are resource-rich and those who have surpluses. Australian, Canadian dollar, Norwegian kroner. I put all my money into bonds from those countries months ago. The euro, I think, here's the what I would call the Sarkozy dominated outcome, and here would be the Merkel dominated outcome. Of course, I say that, I use those words in a specialist sense, where Sarkozy is what they say about Sarkozy's attitudes in the newspapers, and Merkel is what they say about Merkel's attitudes in the newspapers. I don't have a clue what they really think, but if what they say Sarkozy wants happened, I'd say the euro in trouble. I'm all for bringing back the German central bank personally, pardon me, or at least incarnating it into the European Central Bank, because I think that would be a much safer haven for the euro. Who knows what's going to happen to the ruble, the yen, who knows? But there are going to be major winners and losers, and I think it's fairly clear that the dollar and the sterling pound are hell-bent on doing stuff that will lead to their very significant devaluation. And whether they think they can contain that or not, you know, because a lot of bad things happen when you devalue significantly. You've noticed in the papers nowadays, they all talk about, oh, jolly good, you know, the US will be more competitive because the dollar will be devalued. Whew, you know, that was disproved decades ago as a good way of getting out of trouble. So European economies could emerge in a better shape. Germany's decline was among the worst, but we've explained that. France's borrowings are among the highest, but they've always managed to sort of find a way out. German technology capability does offer hope for Germany in the future and its education system and so forth. But stimulus has been lower and the currency is sounder, so all that leads to German economies emerging in a better shape. Ireland, interestingly, has voted yes to Lisbon. There's a famous nursery rhyme which has a little boy getting into trouble because he runs away from his nurse. And the poem ends, "Always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding someone worse." And that's what Ireland has done. And we were joking earlier about how one of these days it would be a huge embarrassment for George Osborne, if he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in a new Conservative government, to be the one who had to come and say, "OK, we give in, we're joining the euro." I'm not sure what the European countries would say. They'd say, "Oh, we don't think so." But that would be the de Gaulle response. But could the UK one day be forced to beg for ECB protection? It's a possibility. I am a patriot, so I shouldn't be too horrible about my country. But we are in a jam. You know, we've spent everything, and it may be that we've fatally broken our economy by taking on the kind of debt and spending the kind of money we have in the past few years.